The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant Major William Hayes adjusted his uniform one final time. Today marked his first day as the commanding officer of the King's Guard, a position he had dreamed of since joining the British Army 15 years ago. The red tunics and black bearskin hats of the Guard stood in perfect formation, their polished boots gleaming like mirrors on the ancient stone. William had earned this promotion through years of dedication and service. He had served in Afghanistan, where he learned that sometimes a commanding voice could save lives better than any weapon. His fellow soldiers often joked that his shouts could wake the dead, but William knew that discipline and respect came from more than just volume. It came from earning trust and showing unwavering commitment to duty. As he walked toward his new unit, William noticed something that made his blood run cold. The guards were slouching. Their formation was sloppy, and some were even whispering among themselves during what should have been silent attention. This was not the standard he expected from the King's Guard, the elite unit responsible for protecting the royal family and maintaining the dignity of the British monarchy. The previous commanding officer, Colonel Pemberton, had been known for his gentle approach. He believed in quiet correction and private conversations. While this worked for some units, it was clear that the King's Guard had grown comfortable, perhaps too comfortable. The tourists gathering outside the palace gates expected to see the finest soldiers Britain had to offer, not men who looked like they were waiting for a bus. William took a deep breath and thought about his grandfather, who had served in the same unit during World War II. His grandfather had told him stories of guards who stood so still that birds would nest in their hats, men who never moved even when children tried to make them laugh. That was the standard William wanted to restore. The other officers watched nervously as William approached. They had heard rumors about his reputation for strictness, his ability to transform undisciplined soldiers into model troops. Some whispered that he was too harsh, while others argued that the King's Guard needed exactly that kind of leadership. What none of them expected was what was about to happen next. Lieutenant Thompson, who had been with the unit for 3 years, stepped forward to brief William on the day's duties. As he began to speak, William noticed that Thompson's boots were scuffed. His brass buttons needed polishing, and his posture was casual rather than military sharp. This was not just about one soldier. This was about the entire culture of the unit. The tourists outside the gates were taking pictures, expecting to see the world-famous discipline of the British Guards. Children pressed their faces against the iron bars, hoping to catch a glimpse of the soldiers who never moved, never spoke, and never broke character. Instead, they were witnessing something that would soon become palace legend. William's jaw tightened as he surveyed the scene. In his mind, he could hear his drill instructor from 20 years ago shouting about pride, honor, and the responsibility that came with wearing the uniform. He thought about every fallen soldier he had known, men and women who had died defending the values these guards were supposed to represent. The moment of reckoning had arrived. William stepped into the center of the courtyard, his boots echoing off the ancient stones. The guards seemed unaware that their world was about to change forever. Some were still adjusting their uniforms casually. Others were staring off into the distance without focus. The lack of military bearing was obvious to anyone who understood what true discipline looked like. As William opened his mouth to speak, a hush fell over the courtyard. Even the tourists outside seemed to sense that something important was about to happen. The guard slowly turned their attention to their new commanding officer, unaware that they were about to receive a lesson in military discipline that would echo through the halls of Buckingham Palace for years to come. What happened next would be talked about in military circles for decades. William's voice erupted from his chest like thunder rolling across a battlefield. "Guards, attention!" The command was so powerful, so filled with authority and controlled fury, that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the palace. The sound reverberated off the stone walls, bounced through the corridors, and carried across the courtyard with such force that windows rattled in their frames. Every single guard snapped to attention instantly, their bodies moving as if controlled by lightning. The transformation was immediate and complete. Backs straightened, chins lifted, and eyes fixed forward with laser-like precision. But the command did more than just straighten the guards. In the distance, the famous changing of the guard ceremony was taking place near the main gates. Those guards, who had been moving with their usual measured pace, suddenly found themselves stepping with perfect synchronization. Tourists noticed the change immediately, whispering to each other about how crisp and precise the movements had become. Inside the palace, members of the royal household staff paused in their duties. Maids stopped dusting. Butlers halted mid-stride, and even the royal corgis looked up from their afternoon nap. The command had carried through the thick stone walls and marble hallways, reaching every corner of the vast building. Some staff members later claimed they felt the hair on their arms stand up, as if the very air had been charged with electricity. The Queen's private secretary, Sir Edward Worthington, was in his office reviewing the day's schedule when the sound reached him. He had been around military men his entire career, but he had never heard anything quite like this. He immediately made a note to inquire about the new commanding officer, sensing that something significant had just occurred in the palace grounds. Outside the palace gates, the crowd of tourists stood in stunned silence. Many had been trying to get the guards to react, making funny faces, telling jokes, or waving colorful objects. Now they found themselves unconsciously standing straighter, some even placing their hands over their hearts without realizing why. Children stopped running around and moved closer to their parents, instinctively understanding that they had witnessed something important. The guards themselves were experiencing their own transformation. Private Jenkins, who had been one of the worst offenders in terms of posture and attention, felt as if he had been jolted awake from a long sleep. His military training, which had been buried under months of comfortable routine, suddenly surged back to the surface. He remembered why he had joined the army, why he had fought for the honor of serving in the King's Guard. Corporal Davies, a 10-year veteran who had been considering leaving the service, felt his pride return like a flood. The command had reminded him of his first day in basic training, when everything seemed possible and every order carried the weight of tradition and honor. He realized he had been sleepwalking through his duties, taking for granted the privilege of wearing the uniform. The other officers watched in amazement as their men transformed before their eyes. Lieutenant Thompson felt both embarrassed and inspired. He understood now why William had been chosen for this position. This was not just about shouting. This was about leadership that could reach into a person's soul and remind them of their duty. Even the palace guards who were not present in the courtyard felt the effect. Those standing at their posts throughout the building found themselves standing taller, their attention sharper than it had been in months. It was as if the command had traveled through the very stones of the palace, carrying with it a reminder of what it meant to serve. The pigeons that usually perched on the palace walls took flight in a great cloud, startled by the power of the voice. They circled the building once before settling back down, as if they too understood that the palace was now under the command of someone who would tolerate no compromise in standards. William stood in the center of the courtyard, his own heart pounding from the effort and emotion he had put into that single command. He could see the change in his men immediately. Their eyes were bright with renewed purpose, their postures perfect, their attention complete. This was what the King's Guard should look like, what the people of Britain deserved to see when they looked upon their protectors. The news of what happened in the palace courtyard spread like wildfire through London's military community. By evening, every officers' club, every barracks, and every military mess hall was buzzing with stories about the new sergeant major, whose voice had shaken Buckingham Palace. The stories grew with each telling, but those who had been there knew that no exaggeration could capture the true power of what they had witnessed. Major Harrison, who had been observing from his office window, immediately called his old friend at the Royal Military Academy. "You need to hear about what just happened here," he said, his voice still carrying traces of awe. "We've got ourselves a real leader, the kind they don't make anymore." His command didn't just reach the guards. It reached everyone within a mile radius. The story reached the ears of General Blackwood, a decorated veteran who had served with distinction in 3 different conflicts. He had been worried about the reports he had been receiving about declining standards in the ceremonial units. Morale was low, discipline was lacking, and the public was beginning to notice. When he heard about William's first day, he knew he had made the right choice in promoting him. Meanwhile, in the palace staff quarters, the household employees were still talking about the moment that had interrupted their daily routines. Mrs. Patterson, the head housekeeper who had worked in the palace for 30 years, told her staff that she had never felt anything like it. It went right through me, she said. Like when thunder rolls overhead, but this was different. This was purpose, pure and simple. The royal protection officers, who were responsible for the security of the royal family, held an impromptu meeting that evening. They had noticed an immediate improvement in the alertness and professionalism of the King's Guard, and they wanted to understand what had changed. Inspector Wallace, the head of royal protection, made a note to meet with William personally. He recognized quality when he saw it. Word even reached the international diplomatic community. The French ambassador, who had been walking through the palace gardens during a scheduled meeting, later mentioned to his wife that something extraordinary had happened during his visit. The British Guards, he said, they were different today, more formidable. It reminded me why they have such a reputation. Back in the barracks that evening, the guards themselves were experiencing a mix of emotions. Some felt embarrassed that they had let their standards slip so far. Others felt energized by the reminder of what they were capable of achieving. Private Morrison, who had been in the army for only 2 years, called his father that night to tell him about his new commanding officer. "Dad, you should have heard it," Morrison said into the phone, his voice filled with excitement. It wasn't just loud, it was like it came from somewhere deep inside, somewhere that understood what we're supposed to be. I remembered why I wanted to be a soldier, why I wanted to serve my country. The veterans among the guards had their own reactions. Sergeant Collins, who had served in Northern Ireland and Iraq, recognized something familiar in William's command. It was the voice of someone who had been tested in real situations, someone who understood that discipline could mean the difference between life and death. He made a mental note to support the new commander in any way he could. The palace staff had mixed reactions to the day's events. Some of the older employees remembered previous commanding officers who had tried to shake things up, only to see standards slip back down over time. They wondered if this would be different, if William could maintain the improvement he had created with a single command. Others were hopeful that the renewed discipline would extend beyond just the guards. The palace had been operating with a certain casual atmosphere that, while comfortable, had not always reflected the dignity expected of the royal household. Perhaps this was the beginning of a return to the standards that had made the British monarchy a symbol of excellence around the world. The Queen herself had been informed of the incident through her private secretary. While she did not comment directly, those close to her noted that she seemed pleased by the reports of improved discipline among her guards. She had always valued tradition and proper protocol, and she appreciated those who took their duties seriously. As night fell over London, the guards took their positions for the evening watch with a renewed sense of purpose. Their movements were crisper, their attention sharper, and their pride evident in every step. The tourists who had witnessed the transformation earlier in the day had already begun sharing their experiences on social media, posting videos and photos of guards who seemed to embody everything people expected from the legendary King's Guard. 3 weeks after the legendary command that shook the palace, William faced his first real test. A delegation from the United Nations was visiting London, and representatives from 12 different countries would be touring Buckingham Palace as part of a diplomatic summit. The eyes of the world would be on the King's Guard, and any mistake would reflect poorly on Britain's military reputation. William stood before his men in the early morning hours, reviewing the day's procedures. The guards looked magnificent in their freshly pressed uniforms, their brass buttons gleaming like gold, their boots polished to mirror like perfection, but William knew that appearance was only part of the equation. Today would test whether the discipline he had instilled could withstand the pressure of international scrutiny. The first challenge came when the delegation arrived an hour early, catching the palace staff off guard. Protocol demanded that the guards maintain their positions regardless of any schedule changes, but William noticed some of his men glancing toward him for guidance. This was exactly the kind of situation where lesser units might break formation or show uncertainty. William remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight ahead, setting the example for his men. The guards followed suit, not moving a muscle despite the unexpected arrival of dignitaries, photographers, and security personnel. The delegation's leader, Ambassador Chen from China, immediately noticed the exceptional discipline of the British guards and whispered to his aide about their impressive bearing. The real test came when a group of protesters gathered outside the palace gates, shouting slogans and waving banners about various international issues. The noise was designed to disrupt the ceremonial proceedings, and the protesters specifically targeted the guards, trying to get them to react or break character. Some tourists joined in, thinking it was amusing to try to make the famous guards move or speak. One protester, a young man with a megaphone, positioned himself directly in front of Private Jenkins and began shouting directly into his face. The verbal assault was relentless and personal, designed to provoke a response. Jenkins felt his jaw clench and his hands tighten on his rifle. But he remembered the power of William's command and the pride it had restored in him. He remained absolutely motionless, his eyes focused on the horizon beyond the crowd. The international delegation watched this display with growing admiration. The Russian representative, General Petrov, had served in elite units himself and recognized true discipline when he saw it. He commented to his interpreter that he had never seen soldiers maintain such perfect composure under direct provocation. The French delegate took photographs, planning to share them with his military colleagues back in Paris. Meanwhile, William was dealing with his own test. A senior palace official, Lord Pemberton, approached him with concerns about the guards' overly rigid behavior. Pemberton represented the old school of thought that favored a more relaxed approach to palace security. He suggested that William might be overdoing the discipline, making the guards seem unapproachable to the public. William listened respectfully to the criticism, then calmly explained his philosophy. "Sir," he said, his voice steady and confident, "the people of Britain and our international guests deserve to see the very best we can offer. When they look at these guards, they should see strength, reliability, and unwavering dedication that cannot be achieved through compromise or comfort." The conversation was interrupted by commotion outside. The protesters had escalated their efforts, with one individual attempting to climb the palace gates. The guards maintained their positions, but their alertness was evident to anyone who understood military bearing. They were ready to act if necessary, but they would not break protocol without direct orders. The palace security team handled the situation efficiently, but the international delegates were impressed by how the guards had remained focused on their duties while staying aware of the potential threat. Ambassador Thompson from Canada remarked that the British guards demonstrated exactly the kind of professional composure that made them legendary around the world. As the day progressed, the delegation toured various parts of the palace. At each checkpoint, they encountered guards who exemplified the same standard of excellence. The delegates began to understand that what they were witnessing was not just ceremonial display, but a demonstration of genuine military discipline applied to the highest level of service. The climax of the visit came during the formal ceremony in the palace courtyard. William stood at the center of his formation, his men arranged in perfect lines around him. The international delegates took their positions on the viewing platform, cameras ready to capture this moment for their respective nations. At precisely noon, William gave the command for the ceremony to begin. His voice carried the same authority that had transformed his unit 3 weeks earlier, but now it was channeled into the formal cadences of military ceremony. The guards moved with precision that bordered on the supernatural, each step perfectly timed, each movement a testament to hours of practice and unwavering dedication. The delegation erupted in spontaneous applause, something rarely seen at formal diplomatic events. Ambassador Chen later wrote in his official report that the British King's Guard represented the gold standard for ceremonial military units worldwide. The day had been more than a success. It had been a triumph that would be remembered in diplomatic circles for years to come. The success of the international delegation visit brought unexpected consequences. Within days, William received a summons to appear before the Army Council, the highest military authority in Britain. Some of his fellow officers whispered that perhaps his methods had been too dramatic, too visible. Others suggested that jealousy from senior officers might be behind the summons. William prepared himself for whatever might come. The Army Council meeting took place in the historic War Office building in Whitehall. As William entered the grand conference room, he saw 5 of the most senior generals in the British Army seated around a mahogany table that had witnessed decisions affecting the fate of nations. General Sir Michael Hartley, the Chief of the General Staff, gestured for William to take a seat. "Sergeant Major Hayes," General Hartley began, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "we've been receiving some interesting reports about your approach to commanding the King's Guard." some quite remarkable reports. In fact, William braced himself, uncertain whether this was praise or criticism. General Blackwood, who had originally recommended William for the position, leaned forward. The international response to last week's delegation visit has been extraordinary. We've received formal commendations from 12 different nations, praising the professionalism and discipline of our ceremonial forces. The Prime Minister himself has asked me to convey his appreciation. What followed was not the reprimand William had feared, but rather a discussion about expanding his methods to other ceremonial units throughout the British military. The generals had been watching the transformation of the King's Guard with great interest, and they wanted to understand how such dramatic improvement had been achieved so quickly. William explained his philosophy carefully, emphasizing that true discipline came from pride and purpose, not fear or intimidation. He described how he had connected with each guard on a personal level, helping them understand their role not just as soldiers, but as symbols of British values and traditions. The Thunderous command had been just the beginning. The real work came in the daily reinforcement of standards and expectations. General Montgomery, the oldest member of the council, nodded approvingly. In my day, we understood that command was about more than giving orders. It was about inspiring men to be better than they thought they could be. It sounds like you've rediscovered that art, Sergeant Major. The meeting concluded with an unexpected proposal. William was being offered a temporary assignment to conduct training seminars for commanding officers throughout the British Army. His methods would be studied, documented, and potentially implemented across multiple units. It was an honor that could significantly advance his career. However, accepting the assignment would mean leaving the King's Guard just when they had reached their peak performance. William asked for time to consider the offer, knowing that his decision would affect not just his own future, but the men he had worked so hard to transform. That evening, William walked through the palace grounds thinking about the choice before him. He encountered several of his guards during their evening duties, and he could see the pride in their bearing, the confidence in their movements. These men had become more than just soldiers under his command. They had become examples of what the British military could achieve. Private Jenkins approached him during a shift change, something that would have been unthinkable under the previous relaxed atmosphere. "Sir," Jenkins said, his voice respectful but concerned, "there are rumors that you might be leaving us. I hope that's not true. You've changed everything for us, sir. You've made us remember why we're proud to wear this uniform." Similar conversations occurred throughout the week. Sergeant Collins expressed concern that the unit might slip back into its old habits without William's leadership. Corporal Davies asked if there was anything the guards could do to convince their commander to stay. The loyalty William had earned was evident in every interaction. The palace staff also made their feelings known. Mrs. Patterson, the head housekeeper, mentioned that the improved discipline of the guards had inspired everyone in the palace to take more pride in their work. Even the royal corgis seemed to behave better around the more professional guards, she joked. More seriously, Inspector Wallace from the Royal Protection Service privately told William that the security of the royal family had never been better. The guards' heightened alertness and improved communication had created a more secure environment for everyone in the palace. From a security standpoint, William's departure could create vulnerabilities. The decision became even more complicated when William received a personal message from a member of the royal household, conveying appreciation for the improved standards throughout the palace. The message did not specifically ask him to stay, but it made clear that his work had been noticed at the highest levels. As William weighed his options, he realized that this decision would define not just his career, but his legacy. He could accept the promotion and potentially influence thousands of soldiers throughout the British Army, spreading his methods far and wide. Or he could remain with the King's Guard, ensuring that the transformation he had achieved would become permanent and serve as a lasting example of military excellence. The choice would reveal what kind of leader William truly was, one who sought advancement and recognition, or one who understood that true leadership sometimes meant staying where you were needed most. The decision deadline was approaching, and the entire palace community waited to learn the fate of the commander who had brought thunder to their quiet world. William's decision came during an unexpected crisis that tested everything he had built with the King's Guard. It was a cold December morning, when news broke that terrorists had attempted to breach security at Westminster Abbey during a major state ceremony. While the threat was neutralized quickly, it sent shockwaves through London's security establishment and raised serious questions about the protection of royal sites. The palace went into immediate lockdown. William found himself coordinating not just his guards but working closely with anti-terrorism units, special forces, and intelligence services. The King's Guard suddenly transformed from a ceremonial unit into the front line of palace security, and every lesson in discipline and alertness that William had taught became critically important. During the 12-hour security alert, William's guards performed flawlessly. They maintained their positions while staying in constant communication with security teams. They managed to keep the palace functioning normally for the royal family, while implementing the highest level of protective measures. Their ability to switch seamlessly between ceremonial duties and real security operations impressed even the most experienced counter-terrorism experts. Inspector Wallace later told William that the Guard's performance during the crisis had been exemplary. "Your men didn't just follow orders," he said. "They anticipated needs, communicated effectively, and never once broke their professional bearing. That's the difference between ceremony and true military readiness." The crisis also revealed something William had not fully realized. His influence had spread far beyond just his immediate unit. Palace security guards, police officers, and even civilian staff had been unconsciously adopting the standards of excellence they witnessed daily from the King's Guard. The culture of the entire palace had been elevated by the example of disciplined professionalism. When the all-clear was finally given, William gathered his men for a brief address. He could see the exhaustion in their faces, but also the pride. They had been tested under real conditions and had proven themselves worthy of the uniform they wore. This was no longer about ceremony or tradition. This was about being genuine protectors of the realm. "Today," William told his assembled guards, "you showed that the King's Guard is not just for show. You proved that true soldiers can adapt to any situation while maintaining the highest standards. You have honored every guard who came before you and set an example for those who will follow." The next morning brought unexpected visitors to the palace. General Hartley arrived with the other members of the Army Council, but this was not a planned meeting. They had heard about the previous day's events and wanted to see firsthand how William's unit had performed under pressure. What they witnessed was a group of soldiers who had been fundamentally transformed. The guards moved with quiet confidence. Their alertness was natural rather than forced, and their coordination was seamless. These were not just ceremonial soldiers playing dress-up. These were genuine military professionals who happened to wear historic uniforms. General Montgomery pulled William aside for a private conversation. "Sergeant Major," he said, "yesterday's events have changed our perspective. We originally wanted to spread your methods throughout the Army, through training seminars and documentation. But what we've seen here suggests something more important. You've created a living example of military excellence that needs to be preserved." The offer was different now. Instead of leaving the King's Guard to train other units, William was being asked to stay and develop his unit into a training ground where officers from throughout the British military could come to observe and learn. The King's Guard would become a center of excellence, demonstrating how traditional values could be combined with modern professionalism. The proposal solved William's dilemma perfectly. He could influence the broader military without abandoning the men he had transformed. Officers would rotate through assignments with the King's Guard, learning not just ceremonies and protocols, but the deeper lessons of leadership, discipline, and unit cohesion that William had developed. Private Jenkins was among the first to hear about the new arrangement, and his relief was obvious. "Sir," he said, "knowing you'll be staying makes all the difference. We've become something special here, and it would be a shame to lose that." The palace household staff also celebrated the decision. Mrs. Patterson mentioned that the improvement in overall palace operations had been remarkable since William's arrival. "It's not just the guards," she explained. "Everyone here has been inspired to do their best work. That kind of leadership is rare." The royal family itself expressed satisfaction with the arrangement through official channels. The increased security and professionalism had been noticed and appreciated at the highest levels. The King's Guard had returned to its historic role as a symbol of British military excellence. As William walked through the palace courtyard that evening, He reflected on how much had changed since his thunderous command had first echoed off these ancient stones. The guards at their posts stood with perfect bearing, alert and proud. The tourists outside the gates were witnessing something truly special. Soldiers who embodied the finest traditions while meeting the highest modern standards. The decision to stay had been the right one, William realized. True leadership was not about advancing your own career, but about building something lasting that would continue to inspire excellence long after you were gone. 5 years later, Buckingham Palace had become known throughout the world as the pinnacle of military ceremony and discipline. Officers from dozens of countries requested assignments to study with William's King's Guard, and the waiting list for such opportunities stretched for months. The transformation that had begun with a single thunderous command had grown into an international center of military excellence. William, now promoted to regimental sergeant major, stood in the same courtyard where everything had started. The morning sun cast familiar shadows across the stone, but everything else had changed. The guards before him represented the finest soldiers from across the British Army, each selected for their potential and their commitment to excellence. Among them stood Private Morrison, now Sergeant Morrison, who had become one of William's most trusted assistants. The young man who had once called his father excitedly about his commanding officer was now training the next generation of guards. His transformation symbolized what was possible when high standards were combined with genuine care for soldiers' development. The international exchange program had brought remarkable results. A Japanese officer who had trained with the King's Guard returned to Tokyo and transformed his unit using William's methods. A Canadian captain implemented similar discipline standards in the ceremonial guard at Parliament Hill in Ottawa. Even the French Republican Guard sent representatives to learn from the British approach to military bearing. The most significant change was in the guards themselves. The culture of excellence had become self-sustaining. New recruits arrived at the palace already knowing they were joining something special, something that demanded their very best effort. The standards were no longer imposed from above. They were embraced willingly by soldiers who understood they were part of a legacy. During a state visit from the German Chancellor, William watched with quiet pride as his guards performed with flawless precision. The ceremony was broadcast live to millions of viewers worldwide, and the comments from international observers were uniformly positive. The King's Guard had become a symbol not just of British military tradition, but of what could be achieved through proper leadership and unwavering commitment to excellence. The personal cost had been significant. William had turned down multiple opportunities for advancement that would have taken him away from the palace. He had remained focused on his mission, while others of his rank had moved on to command larger units or accept prestigious staff positions. But as he watched his guards perform, he knew he had made the right choice. Mrs. Patterson, now in her final year before retirement, approached William after the ceremony. "You know," she said with a smile, "when you first arrived and gave that command that shook the whole palace, some of us thought you might be too strict, too demanding. But you've proven that excellence doesn't come from being harsh. It comes from caring enough to demand the best." The transformation had extended far beyond just military discipline. The palace operations had become a model of efficiency and professionalism. The royal household staff took pride in their work in ways that had not been seen for decades. Even the maintenance crews and security personnel had adopted higher standards. Inspired by the example they witnessed daily, Inspector Wallace, now retired, but still occasionally consulting on security matters, often brought visiting dignitaries to observe the King's Guard. "This is what happens," he would tell them, "when leadership understands that people want to be proud of their work. Give them the structure and support they need, and they'll exceed every expectation." The legacy of that first thunderous command had grown beyond anything William had imagined. Military academies now taught case studies about the transformation of the King's Guard. Leadership courses used William's methods as examples of how to inspire rapid and lasting change in organizational culture. The story had become part of military folklore. As the sun set over London, William performed his final inspection of the day. Each guard stood at perfect attention, their pride evident in every detail of their appearance and bearing. The tourists outside the gates were witnessing history in the making, though most would never know the full story of how these standards had been achieved. Private Jenkins, Now Staff Sergeant Jenkins, and responsible for training new recruits, joined William for the evening briefing. "Sir," he said, "tomorrow we're receiving that delegation from the Australian Defence Force. They specifically requested to see how we maintain standards across multiple shifts and rotations." William nodded, remembering when such international attention would have been unthinkable. Now it was routine, expected, normal. The King's Guard had become the standard by which other ceremonial units measured themselves. The Thunderous command that had started it all was now just the beginning of a story that continued to unfold each day. As he walked through the palace corridors one final time before heading home, William reflected on the power of leadership to transform not just individuals, but entire cultures. His voice had shaken the palace walls 5 years ago, but the echoes of that moment continued to resonate in the hearts and minds of everyone who served there. The King's Guard would continue long after William's eventual retirement. The standards he had established, the pride he had restored, and the excellence he had demanded had become permanent features of the unit. Future commanders would inherit not just a position, but a living example of what was possible when leadership met dedication with unwavering commitment to the highest ideals.